Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Chapter 40. We're going to be talking about the different people inside the corporation. I've kind of teased a little bit of this in the previous chapters where I talked about the changing roles of the shareholders, the officers, and directors, but this chapter really brings it into focus a little bit more. And hopefully by the end of this chapter, you'll understand when I say, there's a variation of these roles depending upon the size of the corporation, whether it's an open or a closed corporation, how it functions. But let's jump in. I think it'll become a little clearer as we start to talk about the roles and define them, and then see how they change. Okay, so let's talk about the directors. So this is sometimes in your book, sometimes management is their preferred term, but director is fine. Directors are the people who set policy for corporations. So if we go back to some of the previous chapters where we talked about trustees or agents, remember we talked about agents and principals, a director kind of has a mix of those responsibilities. Now, North Carolina requires a minimum of at least 3 directors of a corporation. Some states allow you to get away with fewer, but North Carolina got to have at least 3. The initial board of directors is chosen by the incorporators, and then later, usually at the first organizational meeting, there would be either a confirmation vote or there'll be a straight out vote when the bylaws are selected, where the shareholders will then elect the board of directors. And typically they will serve for set periods of time. Usually these are staggered time periods, so let's suppose you have 3 people on a board. One person will serve for 2 years, and then the year that his election's not up, another person will run, and then the third one will be in the cycle too. So you're never going to elect usually the whole board at once, except in extraordinary circumstances. They can be removed for cause. Usually those causes are going to be specified in the bylaws. There's also almost always going to be a kind of catch-all that says commission of a criminal act. Sometimes there's a morals clause that allow you to kick people off of the board of directors. So they do have to meet. They have to have regular meetings. And this is one of the things when I set up corporations for people that you have to really emphasize that if you want to keep it as a corporation and not have problems with piercing the veil, which we've talked about in previous chapters, you're going to have these regular meetings. And you're going to have to ideally keep a record of these. Now, some attorneys will actually have them in their office once a year, and they'll have a secretary or someone keep even very brief minutes, but then they'll keep the minutes. The dates of these meetings are usually set forth in the bylaws. They can be changed by amendments or votes, but they're pretty much at least a yearly. And you have to have a minimum number of directors present. You can't have like surprise meetings where you have a 10-person board or 11-person board and 4 of them call it and they're the only ones that show up. Well, you have to have a minimum number, usually a majority of the board present, sometimes a supermajority, and this majority, and it's going to be set forth in the articles and the bylaws usually, is called the quorum. Now, they have, of course, certain rights, so let's talk about the rights of the directors here. The directors need to be informed that there's any meetings going on. That's one of their rights. And they have to have access to corporate information because they're going to be making policy. If they're going to be making policy, they have to understand what's at stake. Now, one of the things that has changed, and as a student of history, I appreciate the fact that there is this innate prejudice. Sometimes we call it chronocentrism, the idea that what's going on today is what is normal. And one of the things history teaches us is that things change. And in the past, generally, directors were not paid. So you'd be surprised to hear that the chairman of the board or the director of a corporation was someone on the board of directors was not paid. It really didn't become common until after the Second World War, so 1940s. Most directors now are also important officers, so they often will wear multiple hats. They do now get money and or special benefits. One of the big benefits they get is corporate indemnification, so that if they get sued because something they did for the corporation corporation comes in and indemnifies them. It will pay if there's a cost. It'll pay for an attorney, which is a pretty valuable right. What are their responsibilities? Well, the big thing that they have to do is they have to make corporate policy decisions. They're going to appoint the key officers who are going to run the corporation day to day. They're going to make major financial decisions like, what's the dividend rate? Are we even going to pay a dividend? Are we going to issue more stock? Often what they do, particularly with larger corporations, is they break out into smaller executive committees. And it's not uncommon that the board of directors might be a very large and somewhat unwieldy group that meets maybe once a year. And then you'll have compensation committees and auditing committees and whatever other smaller types of committees, and we'll talk about some in a minute, that do a lot of the day-to-day work and have more direct control over the officers of the company. So what are some of these committees I just talked about? Well, executive committee, and they're going to run the company setting policy between the general meetings of the board. The auditing committee, and this is important because the financial health of a corporation is really of concern. So they select, they compensate, they oversee any independent auditors. You have a nominating committee because one of the things, if you own shares of stock, you know that you get little notices, okay, people are up for election, and the board of directors recommends that these are who you should vote for. So they nominate candidates. Compensation committee, and it's kind of self-explanatory, but they decide on salaries and bonuses, stock options, other benefits. One that I'm somewhat familiar with, litigation committees. You have to decide to file or not to file, and sometimes shareholders will want you to, will be pressing you to go forward with rights or actions, and litigation committee, is a good place to stick that request and have it reviewed. See if it makes sense. And in a litigation committee, obviously, you want someone with a degree of legal expertise. So it's not uncommon if, like on the auditing committee, you might have the chief financial officer, may or may not. On the litigation committee, you might have the chief legal officer is there. So the officers and or the executives are hired by the board, and they can be officers and directors, and they have contracts. And they're really going to do a lot of running the company day to day. Now, there's a very blurry line between these two groups. So, in some companies, the officers have maybe more power than the board, not terribly common. In other companies, the board has more power than the officers and may or may not be wearing, as I said, multiple hats, might be doing different things. Duty of care for the directors. Directors must exercise duty of care in making their decisions. So they have to operate in good faith with reasonable prudence. They can't just make crazy decisions. And they have a duty to be informed. So they have to get good information and take reasonable steps to make sure that they make the right decision. Now, obviously, people make the wrong decision. And sometimes the wrong decision is made and it's a completely rational decision. It just turns out not to have worked. Quick example. In the 1950s, automobiles got longer and longer, and they put more and more chrome on them, and they got these what were called fins, where they, at the sides of the trunk at the rear, they started to edge up. And Ford decided that the board that they would approve new models and stuff, that they would approve a concept car that had lots of chrome on it and lots of sweeping angles and exaggerated tail fins. And they made it just at the point where that sort of ostentatious decoration in cars began to fall out of favor. And they lost a lot of money on this car. That car was called famously the Edsel. And people got upset at the board and said, Ford made this terrible decision. And I agree, it's the wrong decision, but it's a reasonable decision. So you can't sue them. You can't. Maybe you can not hire them. Maybe you can take control of the corporation, but you can't sue them and punish them. Dissenting directors should attend all meetings. If you disagree, put it in the minutes. If you can't be present, you should be able to vote a dissent to any decision. So sometimes you can't be present, and there's reasons for it. You have a duty of loyalty, loyalty to the corporation, and there can be clear conflicts between your own interests and the interests of the corporation. If you're sitting on the board of directors, that's a public, your duty of loyalty, fiduciary duty to the corporation supersedes your own individual duty. You shouldn't compete with that corporation. You shouldn't usurp a corporate opportunity. So, the corporation's offered some land to develop, and you bid against that corporation even though you're sitting on it because you think it's more valuable. You shouldn't have conflict of interest in corporate decisions, so very often you shouldn't be running competing businesses. Obviously, insider trading, something we're going to talk about in a little bit, and, which is criminal. You shouldn't intentionally and unnecessarily harm minority shareholders. There can be reasons why minority shareholders don't do as well as the majority, but what you're going to do there is, you're not supposed to go out of your way to hurt them. And of course, you shouldn't sell your votes. Even though it's a private corporation, you don't sell it. A little bit about these conflicts of interest. If you have an outside interest, I always recommend, to avoid problems, disclose it. And if it's really bad, I think most people should recuse themselves from making decisions, saying, look, I have so many vested interests that if I was to make a vote here, it would seem like I was voting in those interests and against the interests of the company, so I'm going to recuse myself. So it's very often the smartest move. If it's that smart a decision, hopefully the other people on the board see it. Now, you can have problems when you have what are called interlocking corporate boards. It's not, or less common now, but it wasn't uncommon for people to sit on the boards of, say, and I'm making this up now, but it would be someone sitting on the board of, say, Sprint and AT&T and T-Mobile. Well, obviously, you've got really competing relationships there, and it's not fair that you are sitting on all three boards. What about their liability? Now, these directors and these officers obviously still have individual liability for their own acts. So if they screw up and they're not acting for the corporation, they're acting for themselves, they still have their own liability. Any agents they employ can extend their individual liability. So if a secretary does something at the direction of the boss or within the scope of behavior, that can be binding against his or her boss. The big protection here is the business judgment rule. Again, if you act in good faith and you've kept yourself informed and you act inside your scope of authority and you made a reasonable decision, you realistically are immune to any lawsuit brought against you by other members of the corporation or the shareholders claiming you didn't do your job. You can make bad decisions. You can approve the edsel. Now, you can't make crazy decisions. The business judgment rule won't protect you, but if good faith, informed, scope of authority, reasonable, you're pretty much protected. Doesn't mean you can't get fired, just means you can't get sued. All right, let's talk about the next major group here, and these are the shareholders. Now, again, their power varies depending upon the size of the corporation. In small corporations, shareholders are very important. If you have 5 people that own all the shares of stock, it's a small corporation, they're really important people. In very, very large corporations, you're only important if you own large blocks of stock. So if you're a mutual fund, an insurance company, an investment firm, yeah, you're going to have some real influence in that company. But if you're Joe Schmo from Alamo and you just bought some shares of Microsoft or shares of Google or shares of Tesla, those boards don't care what you think. You bought it for the financial benefit it's going to give you. Shareholders do not directly control the corporation. If they do, if they start to act that way, if one guy who controls it just supersedes everything that's called for in the bylaws and in the articles of incorporation and runs it, he can wind up having that corporation disregarded and having individual liability. Typically, though, shareholders have no liability. You can't go after a shareholder if the corporation runs up debt. Their total liability is whatever they paid for the stock. What are the shareholders' powers? Well, typically they have the right to vote. They vote at shareholder meetings. Now, there's some changes they absolutely must approve. You're going to change the articles of incorporation, going to change the bylaws, going to engage in a merger or a dissolution. All those have to be. Also, and again, this is kind of jumping ahead to the chapters coming up on merger and consolidation. If you're going to sell most of the corporate assets, you'd have to approve it. If you're going to elect corporate directors, shareholders do that. If you're going to remove someone by vote, you've got to do it by shareholders vote. Big powers there, big powers. Shareholders exercise these powers at their meetings. Now, I just said that if you look at the major corporations in the United States, most of them are owned by, the biggest blocks of stock are owned by other companies. So the biggest, I would guess, I wouldn't swear to it, but I would guess for a company like Google or Amazon or Tesla, that the biggest owners of that are not individuals. They're not John Smith or Peter Doe. They're Massachusetts Mutual. They're Fidelity mutual funds. So very often you might own a mutual fund that itself owns significant numbers of shares in corporations. Just because you own the mutual fund, you're not going to vote. That's going to be up to really, you're going to give the authority to vote your shares very often to the mutual fund. Now, sometimes this is done directly. Sometimes someone comes to you and says, hey, you own stock in Acme Railroad Company. Give me the power to vote your shares. I want your proxy. Sometimes management comes and says, please do that for us. And shareholders can also ask corporations to change their policy. You know, one of the things that's going right now is it started kind of with shareholder activism in the 80s, where there was divestment of shares of stock in companies that did business with South Africa, so apartheidism. So there's a continuing movement like this. Shareholders can ask for changes in social policy, or they can ask for changes they think are economically smart. Now, large corporations have limited this to what is, quote, ordinary business operations. And usually there are minimum amounts of money you have to be able to propose a change, minimum amounts of investment. To get a quorum so that your shareholders' meetings count, you need to have 50% of the outstanding shares, not 50% of the shareholders. Because remember, it's not uncommon that a few small shareholders have the vast bulk of the stock. Then you usually only need a simple majority to win. Extraordinary matters are going to require higher percentages. You're going to shut the company down, you're going to sell the assets, you got to have extraordinary numbers. The corporation is required to keep a voting list of all eligible voters with their name and the number of shares. Remember, this isn't classic democracy. If you have 500 shareholders, 251 shareholders don't win. It's, all right, 500 shareholders, how much stock do they each own? Well, one guy has 200,000 shares. He's pretty important. 10 people have one share. They're not very important. Cumulative voting and trust. Now, there is a problem where if you've got shares of stock, and let's suppose there's 10 people that own shares of stock in a corporation, and 9 of you people have 49 shares, and I have 51 shares. And now we're going to vote for the board of directors. And we say, okay, John Smith's up. Who votes for him? Everybody gets to vote their shares. I got 51, you got 49, you lose. Okay, Tom Jones is up. 51, 49, you lose. Instead, in order to make sure that minority voices are heard, we say, okay, how many shares of stock are out there? 100. How many people are being elected? 50. No, 10. Okay, so 100 shares of stock, there are 10 boards of directors who are voting on. 100 times 10 is 1,000. Everybody has 1,000 votes. All right, first person's up for vote. I'm a majority shareholder. Well, okay, 100 votes. I'm going to cast 51 because I have the majority of votes then. I'm going to cast 51 for my guy. Now, the person with less votes goes second. So this will be the This will be the minority shareholders, then the other people, and they spend 51 votes to elect their guy. When you do this, and there's a number of ways you do this, you can get minority representation on the board of directors. You can also set up voting trusts where you transfer your right to vote. Very often you're getting solicited to give your proxy. You can set up shareholding agreements where you're not turning over your stock, but you're agreeing to vote in a particular way. So big thing that shareholders get is the right to vote. After that, they get stock certificates. Now, can be actual paper, and I showed you some pictures of it in the last chapter, but that's pretty rare. Most of the time now it is just book shares. So they record, yes, you have 100 shares of Amazon, and you don't get a Amazon certificate. If it is an intangible right. So if the certificate's destroyed, but we have a record that you owned it, you can get it reissued. So it's not gone. It's not like if you have $100 in your pocket and you lose it, it's gone. Another big thing you have is preemptive rights, and this can be pretty important. You have the right to maintain the same percentage ownership in the corporation if the corporation is issuing new stock. So let's suppose there's 100 shares of stock out there. There's 10 of us, and all 10 of us have 10 shares. Okay, so 10 times 10 is 100. Now the corporation issues new stock, and I buy all of it. They issue another 100 shares. And now I have 110 shares, and you guys have 90. All of a sudden, hey, you guys have lost control of the corporation. Well, theoretically, as new stock is issued, not treasury shares, we'll talk about what those are in a second, you have the right to buy your proportional interest. Now, if shares have already been issued, but they're held by the corporation, they haven't sent them out for sale yet, when you buy your 10 shares, there's no preemptive rights. But preemptive rights are critical in small corporations and closed corporations so that people can maintain their corporate ownership. All right, warrants and dividends. A stock warrant is the right to buy a set number of shares at a set price. So, quickly, let's suppose that our stock in ABC Corporation right now on January 31st or January 1st is selling for $10. I'm going to give you a stock warrant to buy that stock at $12. Oh, you're not going to exercise it now because you'd lose money. You buy it at 12, it's only selling at 10. If you had to turn around and sell it, you're going to lose $2. So what's the use of the warrant? Well, the warrant can be good for 6 months or a year in the future. It's a way you motivate people to work for the corporation. If I have the right to buy that stock at $12 in a year, and if I work hard as the CEO and I drive up the price of the corporate stock and a corporation is very successful and the stock price doubles, I have the right then essentially to pay $12 for a $20 piece of stock, and that's a nice profit. Dividend is the income the corporation is paid to shareholders by the board of directors. Many stocks pay dividends, many do not. Many rely upon just the increase in the capital value. Classically, stocks like public utilities, like Progress Energy or Duke Energy, tend to pay dividends. It has to come out of net profits and surplus. Now, it's illegal to borrow money and pay them. And you can sue if the directors are intentionally failing to declare a dividend and are abusing their power. There's a very famous case where the Dodge brothers sold their company, Dodge Automobile, and they sold it, and the new corporation said, well, we're not going to issue dividends, and the Dodge brothers were very used to spending that money. All of a sudden they didn't have it, so they had to sue to get the new corporation to pay dividends. For proper purposes, shareholders are allowed to look at the corporate books. They can't be nuisances about it. They can't seek personal gain, but they can look at the books. They have a right to sell their shares. Now, this can be a limited right. It can be that when I sold you the first shares of stock, and when you bought them, you also had to give me, in order to buy it, the right of first refusal. So you got to give me the right to buy those shares back before you sell them to somebody else. The corporation is responsible for recording all the transfers of the company. They're the ones that have to keep track of who owns what, and you know who has the right to vote. All right, dissolution and derivative suits. We have a few more things to cover in this chapter, and I'll try to keep it under half an hour or so. If capital is left over after corporation fails, then you got to pay it out. So a corporation goes belly up. They pay off the creditors who money is owed to and the employees. And at the end of the day, there's money left. Okay, you pay off the bondholders, still money. Now we have to pay the shareholders. Sometimes you can be in a corporation, you say, this corporation is failing, it's never going to recover, we need to get out now, and you file a petition for dissolution. Shareholders also can file what are called derivative suits. And they say, look, the officers or the directors, maybe because they're benefiting, the corporation is being harmed, but the officers and directors won't sue about it. They won't do something. So I'm going to sue for the company. This is common when the interests of the directors and or the officers have really become separated from the shareholders' duties. Okay, liability of shareholders. Your general liability as a shareholder is limited to your investment. Now there's a few issues here which we'll talk briefly about but don't come up too often. Stock subscription agreements. If I have a contract with you when you're an incorporator and you're setting up a corporation, I say I'm going to buy 500 shares of stock, then I have liability to that $500. There also can be something called watered stock. Sometimes a corporation, let's suppose there's 100,000 shares out there and each share is worth $1. Okay, great. So the value of the stock is $100,000. And then the corporation decides that it's going to give stock away to somebody. And usually there has to be what's called a par value here, and I don't want to go too far into that, but basically it's the face value of the share of stock, and most stock can be non-par. But let's suppose it's $1, and that corporation gives 10,000 shares for 10 cents a share. Well, the capital of the corporation is still the same, but there's now 10,000 more shares of stock that this guy got for 10 cents on the dollar, and now my dollar share stocks are worth less because there's more stock out there. So stock issued for below par or for a price that is less is called watered stock and hurts the value. That's an issue. Duties of majority shareholders. Majority shareholders have a fiduciary duty to the corporation. And this is very common if you have a single large shareholder. So someone like Elon Musk for Tesla. You would think that he treats it as his corporation. So he really does behave that way, and the SEC has come down on him a couple times saying he can't say certain things or act certain ways. Majority shareholders, if they misbehave, can wind up having their liability increased. There's this piercing of the corporate veil again, which I talked about. And there's a danger that minority shareholders will sue. Okay, before I go out of this, just a couple quick questions, because this video was made at the instance when there was a bit of a crisis when GameStop was bid up by some people on Reddit, and some hedge funds lost money. Quickly to explain that, because I know I had some questions about it, that essentially functioned much like the hedge funds came in and they sold short. So when someone sells short, what they're saying is, I think that this stock is going to be worth a lot less in the future. So I'm offering to sell this stock right now. I'm going to hold a short position. I promise to buy your stock at your price now in the future because it's going to be less. The problem is if the stock value goes up, okay, and I've promised to buy it, well, in order for me to buy stock, I have to buy the expensive stock now to cover the lost stock. Now that's not very clear. I just realized as I was saying that. So suffice it to say, selling short means you're promising to make good, believing that the price of the stock will fall in the future. If the stock goes up, and a stock can go up an unlimited amount, okay, you have unlimited liability. So most people sell a stock short when they think that a corporation is going to fail. If the corporation doesn't fail, there can be significant losses. And some of these hedge funds apparently lost a lot of money in this last one. Okay, kept it right at half an hour, which is about where I want it. And whenever you're ready, we'll pick up, rounding out this big long chapter on corporations and partnerships and sole proprietorships.